Everybody, good afternoon and welcome. And to check you think you're in the right session, this is all about adaptation in here. So now you're in, even if we're the wrong one, please stay. My name's Emma Cox and I'm Global Climate Leader at PwC, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today on what is a really important subject that I think has been rocketing up the agenda. I'm just going to tell you how the session is going to run this afternoon, and then I'm delighted to be able to hand over to our Global CEO, Bob Moritz, for a few opening remarks on why actually business needs to focus on adaptation, and his views is why this is an urgent problem. We then have Sheikh, who's going to give us, again, some really interesting insights from his perspective as ambassador of Race to Resilience and Race to Zero and the co-chair of the Global Centre on Adaptation, about what he's been thinking about and doing and some plans for the future. And then I have a fantastic panel where we're going to talk about actually making this all real. I've just been in one of the high-level roundtables, and somebody made a lovely remark, which I'm going to steal with pride, which is we've got to stop admiring this problem and do something about it. So whether that is actually understanding the business case, defining the actions, raising the finance, this is a challenge that we've got to address here and now. So we've been working with the Climate Champions on some work that you'll hear about more in terms of linking the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda and actions by business, because there's not enough understanding between the two. So that's what's in store over the course of the next hour. I would love the Q&A session with the panel to become participative. This is not about actually being presented at, although hopefully there will be some of that where you will learn, but it's also taking part yourselves and sharing your ideas on what we should be doing next. So with no further introduction, Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. There's an ongoing adaptation session next door, so you may see a bunch of other people come into this one while we're on stage, and I apologize to the panelists if there's any introduction or interruptions. If you listen carefully to the dialogue that's been going on this past couple of days and what is likely to happen over the next couple of days is a tremendous effort, a number of commitments, and idea generation with the idea of taking stock, mostly about what I'll call mitigation in terms of reduction, and secondarily around how do you actually finance the transition to newer forms of energy that are much more friendly to the world that we live in. What you're not hearing enough of is the reality of where we are today. And the reality is today we haven't made the progress that's necessary. As a result, we have warmed up, and there is real life implications to the world. Most people talk about the negativity associated with that, and there is tremendous negativity as you look at the loss of life, as well as you look at the economic losses that exist from some of the tragedies that have happened, be it flood or famine, or droughts, or other forms of disasters that have primarily hit the most hardest parts of the world, and those are the parts of the world that candidly are most under-equipped to deal with the challenges once those events happen. And if you step back and listen to any study that's out there, the reality is you're talking probably of economic loss in excess of $500 billion each year, most of which is uninsurable, not reported on, etc. It was a couple of years ago, and Emma already introduced him. Sheikh spent some time both at the World Economic Forum and with other elements and cohorts that were part of the dialogues to start to pivot the conversation, not at the expense of mitigation, but rather to get more dialogue happening on adaptation. This was not about one or the other. It was about what we need to do about both. About 18 to 24 months ago, the World Economic Forum asked us to actually write a report on the effects of adaptation and how could we enhance the narrative so it becomes higher on the agenda from an awareness perspective, has balance and proportionality to it in terms of not only the dialogue, but the amount of finance that's going towards it, and frame appropriately what needed to be done. First, create that broader awareness. What is it? Second, enhance resiliency by corporates and by governments, collectively across, if necessary, geographic borders. Third, make sure that we have a more half-full mentality in terms of not necessarily just focusing on the downside risks, but rather the upside potential, the economic returns that may come from those that actually do put capital forward and actually do something differently. And if you do something differently, it shouldn't be take operations or infrastructure or cities and move them somewhere else. Because the reality is, if you have that kind of mindset, you've lost. And again, we're back on the downside risk of people being unemployed, out of jobs, out of economic opportunity, and cities and environments and communities to be wasted, to be moved elsewhere. What we're talking about is how do you adapt to the realities of what we see in front of us, which led to the fourth point, which is how do we work more so together across sectors, within sectors, and across public-private partnerships, but inclusive of that, bringing the youth into the discussions to make sure that we are more holistic in nature in terms of what has to get done. The additional commitment from a year ago was to launch that report, build on that report, and bring forth use case studies. And as Emma said, she'll talk more about that report with the panel in a few moments, bringing to life the level of specificity and the use cases of those that have done it and done it well. And oh, by the way, if done and done well, the economic returns may focus on adaptation, end up far exceeding the upside potential relevant to the avoidance of the mitigation issues. So the ROI and the economics play to be the truth. The reality is you're dealing with something that's more fit for purpose rather than hoping for, planning for mitigation or eventual transformation of an energy crisis and a carbon-intensive environment that we're talking about. But you've got to be focused on all three. And right now we're talking mitigation, we're talking transformation, we're not talking adaptation sufficiently enough. That sets the stage, hopefully, for the next few minutes. I do want to bring Sheikh back up to the stage here with me. As Emma said, he's been an ambassador for the Race to Resilience, Race to Zero. He's been at the table originating with the WEF way back when, the Climate Leaders Alliance, as a co-chair and/or chair for that matter in terms of what we've done. And I can still remember, I think the first time I met him was in the summer Davos on a Friday afternoon where everybody had left and there was about 12 of us in a room talking about the various topics, including adaptation. And oh, by the way, was the CEO of DSM and has been moving on and doing other things with his time, inclusive of still being involved with them. So I want to ask Sheikh to come to stage and address two issues to frame this, and he does have to leave early. One is, Sheikh, how do you see the current state of play from the concept of adaptation? And second, what can be leveraged in these 2 weeks here together in forums like this and others that are happening in other buildings that we can take advantage of and do something to exemplify, to amplify, and then exponentially scale to get the third leg of the stool stronger, bigger, and more impactful? With that, Sheikh, the stage is yours. Thank you very much. Either stand on the microphone or at the podium. Thank you, my friend. Thank you. All right.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. And first of all, thanks for being here. Secondly, thanks to PwC for your commitment to adaptation and making the report, like Bob said, which is important. Important also the awareness. Thanks Eric being here from the World Economic Forum, also supporting. If we would be fully on track at the Paris Agreement, maybe the necessity of adaptation would be a little bit less. Though, climate has been changing always. So even when we would be on track, some adaptation might be needed. But now a lot of adaptation is needed because we are clearly not on track. For many of people believe that climate change is important and it will affect their lives, etc., because there's been some flooding in your cellar or the roads or whatever. But for many people in the world, in Africa, climate change is causing deaths today. It's causing hunger today. So it's not something of the future, it is something of today. And like Macky Sall last year, as counterpart of von Leyen from the African Union said, we Africans, we suffer the most. We Africans, we cause the least. And we Africans are not so sure that you, he meant the West, do take care. And maybe it's an inconvenient message, but it's not an incorrect message. So, like Bob is saying, we need to work on mitigation, we need to work on loss and damage, we need to work on adaptation in parallel. And of course, the mitigation is trying to prevent that we will heat up more than 1.5 or 2 or 2.5 or 3 or 3.5 degrees, because that is where we are today. Loss and damage is doing justice to those who suffered the most, countries like Pakistan, etc., but many others. And adaptation is making us resilient. Now, what do we do in the global climate adaptation centers, and what have we done on adaptation? We have worked out the best practices to adapt ourselves. And first we look, what is the biggest set of issues, what are the most important challenges we need to address? That's food security, that is water, there's protection of infrastructure, protection of cities, and there's the financing of it. So we worked out the best practices on all of that. We're working on seeds and agriculture techniques, seeds which can survive also in drought periods. Hey, that's interesting. That's very interesting for Africa. In Bangladesh, seeds who can survive if it is heavily flooded. Water systems which are more resilient to climate change, but also protection of infrastructure, cities, etc. Also financing. There is 25 billion at this moment allocated at the African Development Bank for implementation of adaptation projects in Africa. Good. So we need to address this. Not good, because a large part of the world, including the private sector, does not really understand what adaptation is. Adaptation is addressing climate change, yeah, but different than mitigation. It is becoming resilient in the assumption that there is climate change, and we need to work on the seeds, agriculture techniques, water, all the things I mentioned. What is a little bit of sadness is that the 25 billion at the African Development Bank, only for Africa, hardly finds its way to the private sector. The private sector hardly finds its way to the money. It's a total disconnect. At this moment, 0.5% of the global budgets on adaptation are financed by the private sector. The private sector is absent in the whole area of adaptation, which is very, very strange. Because first of all, there is a self-interest for the private sector to work on adaptation. Because our own supply chains, those who are dependent on agricultural input streams, are being threatened. Those who have locations who can be flooded are threatened. Those who have locations where maybe there's a shortage of water should not think that their workers will turn up in the factory when there's no drinking water. So there is a self-interest to make that mapping of the risk and to see how companies can adapt itself. Second incentive for companies. Some companies, and there's not a dirty word, can make money by doing adaptation projects. They can build dikes, they can protect infrastructure, they can develop these new seeds, they can do business. And like I said, there is even money for that. And it's not a dirty word that the private sector can make money with this. I come from a country where 3/4 of the country would not even exist without adaptation. And this was built by a collaboration between the public, the government, and the private sector. Now, my plea is, and I'm very happy with what PwC have been doing, Bob's support over the years on adaptation. We need to continue to work on mitigation. We need to continue to fill in the loss and damage. But in parallel, not instead of, in parallel, We need to work on adaptation. We need to make the world more resilient. And there are certain areas in the world, like Africa, like Bangladesh, like many other countries, who are much more vulnerable than others and who need the adaptation right now and can not only count till the adaptation will come from the public sector and their country heads, because the technologies and the innovations are owned by the private sector. So we need to bring in the private sector to do that. And we need, like Bob was saying, to make the private sector aware. We need to make clear what problems we have and let them working with the finance budgets we have on the different projects. I think we owe this to the world. And I quote again, if several leaders in Africa are saying, we cost the least, we suffer the most, and we are doubting about your commitment, then the Western world and the Western companies, together with companies in the Global South, have a responsibility. One remark I make, because we still have a journey to go. Last year, we had the Global Adaptation Center Summit, which we have every year, in Rotterdam, where the global headquarters is. There were 12 African presidents flying 10 hours. Of all the European presidents and prime ministers, except the one in the Netherlands, but he could take the bike to come to the conference, all others cancelled and sent one of their ministers. The African presidents and prime ministers asked me, what kind of signal is this? You still don't get it. For you, it is mitigation and not adaptation. If you don't turn up with a 1-hour flight out of Europe and we fly 10 hours out of Africa. Again, also an inconvenience happening, but the message, hey, do you really take care, is a correct one. So therefore, I cannot support enough the PwC effort to address adaptation. I think all of you in the private sector, I only want to stimulate you, see what kind of technologies, innovations, tools you have which can be used. And if you need help, how to find the projects, how to find the money, use also the World Economic Forum, use us as GCA, maybe use PwC, and to find, hey, where are those projects and how can we guide and help you? Please do so. Adaptation is of essence today. Thank you very much.
Feike, thank you so much. That was a wonderful call to action, I think, for us all. And the words of Antonio Guterres are kind of ringing in my ears as you sit down, that actually adaptation and mitigation have to be pursued with equal urgency. So, practical ideas on how we're going to actually make that happen is kind of where we're now going to move on to next. Here at the time of the Global Stocktake, we're also looking at the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, which was launched in Glasgow 2 years ago. And it's really, I think, from a business perspective, not very well understood, not really known about. There are 30 goals. How many of us could actually quote them? Most of us could talk about keeping 1.5 alive and talking about transition pathways on mitigation, but we haven't got that same level of familiarity on adaptation. That said, the first implementation report on the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda was launched this morning and highlights the importance of taking action on this, and brought in across 6 impact areas that are covered in the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda. A new one was brought in relative to what was launched in the first place, which was health. And I think there is been interesting to have a bit of a discussion here on health and adaptation and the interconnectivity with other systems like food, waterborne diseases, etc. So that was just hot off the press this morning. Now, with the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, there is a focus on 6 systems: food and agriculture, water and nature, human settlements, coasts and oceans, infrastructure and health. And there are cross-cutting levers of policy planning and finance. This is not necessarily a way that business has looked at it. So one of the things that we're very pleased to be supporting the climate champions on is the development of a discussion paper that's going to be launched after COP that tries to bring alive what is the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda and how does it connect with actions that businesses are taking. Feike spoke and Bob spoke a little bit about work that we've been doing with the World Economic Forum. There we launched a framework, where the forum launched a framework which set out how business in three very simple pillars could address adaptation, starting by understanding risk, then looking at how you shape opportunity, and then how you collaborate with others. And Marissa and others were involved with that. And I'm delighted to say that framework has been picked up by the climate champions to use in this assessment of the intersection between businesses' actions on adaptation and the overall UNFCCC process and the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. So what we wanted to try and do was demystify it and link and explain the one to the other so that businesses actually kind of go have that aha moment of saying, oh, actually I'm doing more than I think. Oh, if I called this adaptation, maybe I could get some, better plans together. Maybe I could get some better finance together. Maybe I could package this up in a different way. We've also been having a look at where are there real traction and where is there not yet enough traction. And what's interesting is that there's been really quite substantial progress, but it's not fast enough. Food and ag and water and nature are moving much faster in terms of business action than health, human settlements and infrastructure. Now, that's interesting. Again, maybe ponder that a little, and maybe within the panel we can have a think about why is that happening, and what actually, as business voices or NGOs collaborating in this space, can we do? So taking action from now does require education, it requires capacity building, it requires dialogue between parties who don't necessarily all work together, and it requires an enabling framework that will allow finance to flow at a much greater rate. Because as Feike said, it's a pitiful amount that is currently going from the private sector to adaptation. It's not a very large amount that's going from the public sector to adaptation, but yet we're living with the experience of a changing climate all the time. The agreement of the Loss and Damage Fund is a great step forward in terms of these negotiations. What would be great would be to see, can we actually also set the scene for taking further action on adaptation? So, with that being the framing, and you've heard it all about how important it is, can I bring up a fantastic panel to the stage? And if you'd all like to just come up and sit down while I introduce you. So we've got Marissa Drew, Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. Sanjay Waggle, co-founder and managing director of the Lightsmith Group. Michael here, Chief Sustainability Officer of McCormick, and last but by no means least, Roman Roll, Climate Change Specialist at EIB. So big welcome to you all. So you've heard quite an introduction there about the challenges of the pace of change, but also that food and ag is leading the way. So maybe, Michael, I can start with you because you are in that food and ag system. Can you talk a little bit about, A, what you do, introduce yourself and your business, but what are your views on the importance of adaptation and how can we go faster in driving resilience, and share some of your ideas? Thank you.
First of all, thanks to PwC for organizing this, and I really appreciate you and Bob as well. I'm really glad to see everybody here. This is why we gather, so that we can start to exchange ideas. So my name is Michael Korafor, and I am the Chief Sustainability Officer for McCormick. And for most of you that don't know McCormick, it is the largest herbs and spice company in the world. In fact, people say there is nothing else other than McCormick. So we're #1 seasoning. And for those of you that know us very well, I applaud you, because that means you're all very good cooks. Now, let's talk about what we're doing. Let me go back to a point you were making, Bob. I'm going to be, how do I be very direct. There is no resilience without adaptation. Let's not kid ourselves. And the reason that we'll have to take this thing very seriously, before I talk about what McCormick is doing, is really very simple. One, for people that are impacted, which is 70% of the world at least, it's about they're afraid of dying. If you don't realize this, think about Pakistan last year. How many people were lost? These are souls like you and I. And it could have been any of us. So that's one. That's a business case. We need to stop this death that is occurring at a scale we've never seen it before because of climate change. Two, for businesses like us and for most businesses, including the consulting businesses, it is about creating an enduring supply chain. Let me put it simple for you. If we don't have something to sell, we don't have a business. And I will argue that PwC doesn't have a consulting business to do. Okay? So this is business cases. We have to find a way to create an enduring supply chain. And the only way you can do that is to ensure not just that we do mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience, is that we ramp up adaptation. Because without adaptation, as I said earlier, there is no resilience. And so what have we done at McCormick? You will say, if you guys knew this, what have you done? Let me tell you a little bit about what we did. We actually changed our approach to helping communities. In fact, I made a statement that people push back on, and today they are saying, Mike, that was prophetic. I said the era of CSR is over. Corporate social responsibility. If you're still doing that, stop it. You are in the ancient age. We got to come to the modern age, okay? You have to embed this thing we talk about in your business strategy. In fact, when you do a long-term plan, let me challenge you, make sure that sustainability is the foundation of your long-term strategic plan. So at McCormick, we realized this in 2016. And you asked me, what was the epiphany? If you guys remember, we sourced from over 80 different countries around the globe. And these countries have one thing in common, just one thing. They are all in the global south. And you say, why? You tell me how you can farm cinnamon in Minnesota or even in Finland. It doesn't work. This is not the regular trees that grow in Finland. Okay? So the bottom line of what I'm saying is the health and well-being, the resilience of those communities are critical to our own livelihood, if you don't realize that. Okay? Two, when we did that, it became obvious. In fact, for me, it was the cyclone in Madagascar in 2015. It was a bad one, and it devastated the areas where the vanilla growing areas, the Mawansetra, the Andapa, the Antananarivo, it's not Antananarivo, that's the capital, nothing grows there. I'm talking about those areas, Mawansetra and all along. And when that thing happened, guess what? It became obvious that if we don't do something, we're going to be in trouble. And so we went ahead and set up a strategy called purpose-led performance, which means we embedded the entire business structure on this idea of purpose, on how to really do well by doing good. That's what we call the purpose-led performance. There are three strategic pillars: people, communities, and planet. This is before ESG in 2016. And we issued the first report in 2017. And that people, communities, and planet, we focused on the communities. Communities where we live, communities where we work, and communities where we source. They are intertwined. And so we started doing things. And lo and behold, that's how far we started. And when we started building these adaptation strategies in those communities where we source, you wouldn't believe it. USAID noticed and came to our aid. So we were the first company to advocate on blended finance, by the way, for those of you in the financial community. So that's what we talked about. And they co-funded with us. Let me give you one example of what we did. Because women didn't own most of the farms in Madagascar. By the way, 80% of the world's natural vanilla comes from Madagascar. Not the chemical stuff that will kill you, the real stuff. And these women were farmers, but they work for men. 100% of the farms were owned by men, and you know, there is no incentive if you don't do that. The reason I'm going through this is to tell you what you have to do to really make a meaningful impact. And so we created a village savings and loan McCormick paid the interest on the savings and loan upfront. So these women and some men took the loan, started the farms, and when they sold their crop to us at a premium, they paid back the loan without the interest. Today, they are thriving. That's the kind of thing you have to do. You have to be a catalyst for doing good if you want to create an enduring supply chain. And last thing I will give you as an example why you must rethink how we go after things. During the COVID, you know the packaging materials for packaging our spices? They were making it like 3 miles from our largest plant in Hunt Valley, Maryland. 3 miles. We couldn't get enough to package our stuff. Vanilla, black pepper in Vietnam. Because of what we're doing in those communities, we didn't lack any. Because people were producing and they preferred to sell to us. So I'm going to pause because what I'm just trying to do is to stimulate the conversation in the real sense, not academic sense. This is real practical things. And last but not the least, because these women now own their own farms and they are doing well, the kids are in school. And when people talk about no child labor, what will you do when you can't eat? You take the kid to the farm. When you have money, you send your kids to school. And I know what I'm talking about because I grew up in one of those communities. And I went to a private school because my mom can make enough money to pay for that education. So let me pause there. Thank you very much.
Michael, that was great and really brought it to life in a human, practical context, but also the scale and the reach that you have that underpins what, products that all of us use. But a lot of this does come back to access to finance, right? And we have a great panel here of people who know all about finance as an enabler to progress. And maybe, Marissa, maybe I could start with you. We know not enough finance is going into adaptation. You've done a lot to champion this area, a lot of great research on it, a lot of great practical new products. Would you like to give us and the audience a bit of a benefit of your thinking on this and how we drive progress? And then Sanjay, I'll come on to you.
So with pleasure. And Michael, I think you are the expression of exactly why I am passionate about this subject. So I am the Chief Sustainability Officer for Standard Chartered Bank. We are a bank whose footprint is in the very markets where you're talking about the reality happening. And I'm relatively new in my post, a little over a year in after having most of my career being at a Western institution. And observationally, all rules were written in the West in sustainability, somewhat imposed or suggested or urged or agitated on Global South. And as I am in this position where our primary markets, our nexus of operations is Asia, Africa, Middle East. When I did my tour of duty and I am talking to my clients in my markets and I'm hearing the reality of what they're facing, my aha moment. So then I said, well, why is the finance not headed there? And my whole career has been about building asset classes and mobilizing capital at scale. What is the common denominator when you're trying to get capital to move at scale? It is a common adopted set of principles and standards and a definition that the markets can embrace, because we can't have every individual financial player writing their own rules. It doesn't work that way. And so then I started to say, well, this adaptation finance thing is, it's necessary. When I started then to talk to the capital allocators, banks, partners, peers, etc., what did I find? Adaptation, that's a government problem. Isn't that a government problem? Not a private sector problem. And why were they saying that? Is because they couldn't frame this in a way that the financial services community could understand as a commercial proposition that made money. And I'm going to quote literally Eric, which was, why has it been something that people don't even want to engage in when it's so necessary, and our businesses, our clients are getting disrupted, our markets are getting disrupted, the own goods and services we want to buy are going to be disrupted or are disrupted. Why aren't we engaging? And Eric said to me, I think it's because by saying and engaging in adaptation, it almost means that we failed on mitigation, right? Because that says that we're dealing with the reality of climate change. Last time I checked, the planet's screaming. We're past that conversation. So that is why I'm actually a little excited that we're here having this dialogue with esteemed partners and parties, because now it's on the table. Now we have to define it. So now I talk to my finance peers and I say, let's talk about adaptation. What? What is that? So we have to define it, and that's through the good work of PwC and many others. We're actually trying to create a definition the financial community can understand, and I'm thrilled that Bob picked up on the ROI point, because we try to do a piece of research to put it it in financial terms that we could embrace as a private sector. We did a study on 12 emerging market countries, some frontier, some middle income, fast growing, all massively affected by the effects of climate change in their businesses and their countries. And the math that we came up with, ROI terms, put it in financial terms that people can understand, was that the cost of inaction in terms of loss and damage is so enormous, it surpasses any kind of ROI you'd think about in any conventional private equity fund or what have you. First of all, it is exponentially more costly at an exponential rate the longer you wait. And the higher the temperature goes, the more that math even gets worse. So our math basically said, if you invest now today, you get a 12 times return on that money. 12 times return. You know, that's pretty darn good, even in a high interest rate environment. I'll take that all day long. Then the next thing was, okay, if we define it, where are the places that you can invest? And my analog for this is when people said oceans weren't investable for profit. That's been a passion of mine, and we proved them wrong. And we went about it by working with many others, like the PwCs of the world, to create the categories. Let's make it easy for people. Where can you invest for profit? You can invest in companies like McCormick, who are deeply affected. Why? Because commercial imperative creates a commercial reality. So therefore, it shouldn't be that hard. So that's sort of the journey that we've been on, and now we're focused on use cases. So we have now come out with if anyone's in the financial community, it's a practitioner's guide for how to think about this. So that then the next thing is, I think we need lots and lots of these cases, because I'd love to say we're all so fabulous in the financial services world. We're a lot of lemmings. We like to copy what's worked. So if we can get a few of these cases out there within each of these categories and say this one worked, it was a commercially promising, viable opportunity, then I think the money will flow. And I'll stop there because I think there's someone who I didn't know existed, and he was a man before his time because he's got an adaptation fund from 5 years, I think. So I want to have you have the conversation. But the one other thing that I'm happy about is we did a poll, and we were asking people what was their propensity to invest in adaptation. Here's the hopeful message: less than 0.1% of climate finance has gone to adaptation. But we did ask the big asset managers. These are people running really big pools of capital, billions and billions. 75% said that they were going to allocate more capital to this space. I've had loads of bilateral meetings here at COP, one of the benefits of COP, and big asset managers are saying they're actually raising funds where the word adaptation is now in the lexicon. It's climate and adaptation, or something and adaptation. So we're on our way. So that's my hopeful message.
Brilliant, brilliant, Marissa. And actually, the parallel round table that's going on at the moment, there was a conversation between BlackRock and Bank of America on exactly that subject. So I think people are picking it up. But Sanjay, a man ahead of his time, I think you were just called just then, which is a great introduction.
As an investor, I'm not sure you want to be too far ahead of your time. Like just ahead of your time is perfect. But
bring it to life for us.
I'm really glad to hear that it's catching on. 5 years ago when we launched Lightsmith Group, we were the first private investment fund focused on adaptation, and we looked, there weren't any others. And now, as you pointed out, there are people talking about it, investing in climate adaptation, and that's great. We need a lot more of that. As FICA pointed out, there's far too little. I have a lot of reasons to be optimistic and believe we can scale up from now, call it hundreds of millions of investment per year to hundreds of billions that we need in developing countries alone, according to the UN's Adaptation Gap report. And the reason why is I've seen how over the last 20 years, we passed the first $1 billion invested in the energy transition to now $1 trillion annually worldwide. And we can do the same thing for adaptation, and we need to, because these are massive transformations of every sector that need to take place. And we need to do it smart. This isn't just about big infrastructure projects and seawalls. We need to use technologies to adapt in the smartest way possible. And I actually think that is very possible. Because there are lots of technologies out there that deliver strong value propositions to their customers, immediate financial ROI. They're investable. They have a strong business case. And that's, of course, what made clean energy take off, when it was just a better, or what made electric vehicles take off. It's just a better car. They're not buying climate mitigation. They're buying a better car at the right price. Same thing with adaptation. And I'll give you two examples from our investing. We talked a lot about food and agriculture, so I'll give two food and agriculture examples, one from India, one from Brazil. And interestingly, most of these companies don't call what they do climate adaptation, but they are adaptation solutions. So a food supply chain services company in India, South India, that uses digital technology, forecasts, analytics, and to manage logistics, to buy the right food, the right places, the right times. They buy from 100,000 farmers. They sell to 100,000 grocers across South India. And what's interesting about this, in doing so, they vertically integrate the supply chain. They make it a lot more efficient. They use weather forecasts. They make it a lot more responsive to changing conditions. And they reduce food waste from an average of about 15 to 18% across India to under 2% in their supply chain. I saw this beautiful produce, chard, green peppers, kabocha squash, that was picked that morning, that was going to be on a shelf in Bangalore the next morning. And that's better than our supply chains, frankly. And so reducing food waste, can you imagine a way to suddenly make 15% more food available at negative carbon? That is an adaptation to the increasing pressures being put on food and agriculture from climate change. I'll give another example. There were floods 3 winters ago across South India. There was 2 to 3 feet of standing water for 2 weeks in Chennai. This company made 100% of its deliveries because it had forecasted the storm, it was able to reroute trucks, and it has a very robust supply chain in place. It used technology to deliver food, not waste food, and be responsive to changing climate and weather conditions. Profitable company, growing rapidly. To us, that's an adaptation business. They don't say the word adaptation. We invested in a precision agriculture software company in Brazil that uses sensors and software to optimize farming operations. They started in Brazil in the sugarcane industry. They're now in almost every crop in 11 countries across the Americas. And they help farmers reduce fuel, reduce chemicals, reduce fertilizer. But interestingly, this operations platform also uses weather forecasts and in-field real-time weather data from many weather stations to help farmers change their operations as weather changes. And that's kind of an obvious thing you would want to do in farming, and yet farmers don't have tools to do that. And so both these examples, interestingly, they're helping adapt in the critical food and ag sector, but they're also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yes. So you're getting mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And they are great examples of South-South transfer, technologies that originated in developing countries that are now spreading to other developing countries.
Sanjay, that's wonderful. And your craft fund, I think people can find information out about it if they want to know more.
Sure, look up Lightsmith Group.
Very good. And so actually sharing some of these examples, which people aren't calling adaptation, is one of the things that we're going to try and do to help raise awareness of it. But another of the challenges, Roman, if I can come to you, is we hear a lot that adaptation projects aren't financeable, they're too risky, or they're too small, or they don't come up in the right way. Blended finance is talked about, but it's not at the scale that is needed. From the EIB's perspective, how do you see this market emerging? What do you see as the opportunity, and what's the role of an organisation like the EIB in helping to unlock and drive that finance? And then we'll come to questions, everybody, so keep thinking.
Thanks, that's a great question. So for those of you who don't know the EIB, it's the European Union's lending arm. We invest around 60 to 70 billion euros every year. A lot of that is infrastructure across all sectors, mobility, renewables, hospitals, schools, etc. A lot goes through SMEs and businesses through our intermediated lending with client banks. And we invest a lot in innovation and research development, etc., through project finance, funds, etc. So we realized, we have both the problem and the solution right in our portfolio, but we're not really, paying enough attention to that. We realized that, several years ago. So we really started to get on top of that through a number of measures, and I think. Collaboration is really key to make this all work and scalable. And we are still on the curve. We're still on the learning curve. We're still ramping up the financing. But one of the first things we did is that we started to really screen and assess every project we do in order to challenge and also collaborate with our clients to identify any material risks and see what we can do together to bring it down to an acceptable level, especially for our long-term investments. Sometimes our lending is really covering decades, so we are locking in a lot of our capital into basically the climate change that we're all seeing materializing now. I mean, it's only going to get worse before it gets better. So we did that, so very, very much collaboration with our existing clients. Then we set a target for the bank to really collaborate internally across all teams to find, to master all the creativity that we have in the institution, to use our existing client base, our financial products, to get adaptation financing out through all gates. And we are trying to do really something that's extraordinary in just 3 years that we have now. Actually, it's only 2 years left that we have now. We're trying to triple our adaptation finance by the end of 2025. We can't do it ourselves, of course. So again, we're really relying on our existing partners, our clients, also institutional relationships that we're having to help us and make that happen. So again, we talked about capacity building, technical assistance, to find the projects that have adaptation in it, even though clients may not even be aware or they're not packaging it and selling it as adaptation, because that's not what we've traditionally done. But that is gaining a lot of traction in the European Union now, thanks to the EU taxonomy. For those of you who care about that, it's really telling us how to speak a common language around what adaptation is, and it helps us really to originate projects, bundle even smaller activities together into larger envelopes that make them investable. And create a lot of traction and demand for these type of things. And we're seeing this picking up. Our adaptation finance the demand is really picking up. It's still, you could say even unacceptably low, given what we're seeing in volumes and demand in the renewable energy space, for example, for mitigation. We still have a lot of work to do, but we are seeing this is beginning to work, right? And we want to continue that. We have resources thanks to the European Commission, where we can provide technical assistance and advisory services also for private sector clients to really develop adaptation investments that are bankable. So please talk to us if that is of any interest to you. We are more than welcome to listen to you and see what we can achieve together.
What a fabulous set of insights. I've listened, actually spellbound to this whole thing, thinking about the caliber of what you're all doing and driving in this important market. I'm sure there are some either comments, observations, sharing that we'd like to do at the back there. And do introduce yourself first.
Hello. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting panel. My name is Marcia Toledo. I'm Adaptation and Resilience Director for the Climate Champions team, and very much impressed by the leadership of the different businesses, private sector, across many different sectors, especially on what it takes to build a narrative, exchange on their examples, highlight what is actually adaptation solutions. And that's the spirit of the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, is recognizing that there are all those solutions that are tangible, that are practical, and by putting and aggregating those in near-term targets, what we are trying to make is more manageable and achievable, rather than disconnecting the reality of the business, the reality of the supply chain on all the contexts that private sectors engage, and make it really more practical. So what we are actually also very keen is continuing learning what are those opportunities for businesses to better showcase their leadership on adaptation and resilience, what are opportunities for cross-fertilization, how can more can be highlighted, the contributions that are already doing in regards to finance mobilization, but also on a specific type of actions, methods, frameworks, tools, so that it can be used and supported by the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda in a way of being a platform to help elevate, showcase, and support those steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for push and impetus that you're giving this important agenda from the climate champions. And I think to anyone in the room, if you have examples you want to share, we have ways of publicising them. There's a question over here.
Thanks everyone for the really interesting panel. 2 questions. One, I think, first for Michael.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Danielle Boyd from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. I think the first question for Michael would be interesting to hear. You sound like you've been doing some great initiatives with a lot of the farmers that produce the food. Was there ever a challenge between the initiatives that you were able to put in place to help build their resilience, or perhaps using different farmers in different areas that are less vulnerable, and how did you kind of balance that that challenge? And I think I've forgotten the second question. The second question is, I think a few of you mentioned the importance of speaking a common language, really understanding what it means to invest in resilience, and perhaps packaging up maybe things that were, businesses that are already in place, activities, etc., that we could call adaptation. So how important is that as the first or next step, and how do we kind of maybe scale that a bit more?
Brilliant. So Michael, first you, and then...
Thank you. That was a brilliant question. I'll be honest with you. There were 2 major challenges on the get-go. So you have some wisdom there. You know what they were? 1, finance. 2, very important, in the farming communities around the globe, and for those of you who have a little experience in that, you will appreciate this second one. Eliminating predatory activities in the farming communities. The reason that farmers are impoverished is because of predators. And most of the predators are called middlemen, if you understand what I'm saying. So if you go to a farming community, this is not like Cargill, as I said, or Archer Daniels Midland. These communities are individual mom and pop, human beings like you and I, and they start their business. But when they finish farming, they sell it to a middleman. And notice my word, middleman, I'm using it deliberately because I've never seen a middlewoman in this business. They sell it to a middleman in the village. So you have 500 people in the village, for instance. They sell to a middleman in the village. That middleman sells to another middleman in the big city, who sells to another middleman, who now sells to us. In the process, these people are impoverished. They can barely feed their children. These middlemen are driving Mercedes-Benz and they're expensive cars, and they're living like this. So the first thing we had to do was, how do we eliminate these middlemen so that whatever we invest can go directly to the farmers? And of course, this is another thing. We have to be creative. We didn't have a solution for that. But there is an NGO called NCBA-CLUSA in Washington, D.C., that is an expert in building cooperatives. In fact, the guy from DSM that just left, he's from Netherlands.
Yes.
There is, Avibi, which is, Avibi's potato cooperative. They are precedent in those. And so this NGO then went into, let me give you, in several communities.
Michael, I'm going to keep you moving on because we need to get, there's a couple more questions here.
That's what is happening. So they went and did that, and we solved that problem by eliminating the middlemen. So these farmers can now sell to us. The second thing on finance is we started because we created a Village Savings and Loan, VSLA. And guess what? They got the money, and they adhered to our farming standards. And the rest is history. They had farming sustainably, preserving the planet, not disrupting the soil, and all the things. And so that's what we've done. That's how we addressed it. Does that help you? Excellent. Thank you.
And I might be able to answer the finance one really quickly. So as a regulated entity, we have the regulator very focused on topics like greenwashing and any labeled instruments that we're producing as a bank. In order to be very clear with what we're calling something green or transition or social, we've had for a very long time frameworks that say when we say something's green, this is what we mean by green, because there isn't a common definition for green. We're in the process process of creating a same type of framework for adaptation. We will make it public. We'll have those categories. We'll say why we labeled something the way we did. And then we're very happy to share that because we think that then if others can say, okay, that's what adaptation looks like, it's back to that sort of idea of let us give you case studies of what we mean when we say adaptation. I think it brings others along, and then it just starts to take on a life of its own. The only other point I would make, sorry, really quickly, is just on other financial ways of participating, where I think we can think a little bit outside the box from the normal way we express finance. Michael, you brought it up, which is a supply chain. Who are the end buyers in the supply chain? It's usually large cap corporates. Who's at the front of the supply chain, the very small farmers you're talking about? We have this problem where the big guys are saying, I want to ensure security of supply chain and I want to make sure it's sustainable. At the other end, they're saying, I don't have the money to do this, and who's going to pay for that? People like us who are in that trade finance arena can say, if you do things, because I look at it from a risk lens, if I'm going to put my money out there and the supply chain's broken, you're a bad credit risk. If you do the following 5 things to make yourself more adaptable or more resilient, you become a better finance opportunity for me, less risky, better for me to either give better terms or just provide finance in the first place. And I think if we can get that into the lexicon too, this better risk, better business.
Could I just offer a quick thought? Taxonomy, language we use, definitions, what is adaptation is very important. I would argue that for mobilizing private capital, just as important is a few success examples. A couple companies that do really well and make their investors a lot of money, it crystallizes what we're talking about, that adaptation is profitable.
Yeah, I completely agree. There were a couple more questions. Can I take 2 questions at once, and then we'll pick up on them, and then Eric, very quickly, if we can, just fit you in as well, and then Bob to close, if that's all right. So. Great.
Chris Dorrell from Impacts Asset Management. So I know quite a few of the people on the panel, and those I don't know I'm going to come and chat to. The business participation and cooperation in this space is really admirable. My question is, there are market failures out there, there's lack of knowledge, and there's also potential push that could be given to particular industries. What would your asks be of policy? Because there's been very little discussion around, apart from more disclosures, where can policy push this agenda forward?
Okay, and then if we take this as well, so asks of policy.
Yes, hi, this is Christoph from Yapu Solutions and Scale for Resilience under the Race to Resilience. We are working with the financial sector, so I'm totally happy to hear the topic of finance so prominently here. We're going to be publishing, I think, 7 different case studies over the next days, which show where small institutions are working on adaptation and resilience, financing it according to standardized taxonomies. Still, even with the EIB, we are talking with several arms. It's very difficult to transform this into bonds. We have one example, or having large credit lines, they take years till they get out. Yeah, we have worked on these too. So what can be done so that we can raise the ambition in financing adaptation?
Yeah, so we've got what are the policy levers, what can be done to speed it up. Eric, do you want to make a comment in just before the panel answer? And do introduce yourself.
Okay. Eric White with the World Economic Forum. This is dangerous. I might ask a difficult question, but let's see what we can do. So a piece of research that we're going to put out day after tomorrow that was done with PwC shows that most large global businesses are looking at adaptation business opportunities, but you almost never hear them talk about it. I have personally heard executives tell me that if they speak about adaptation, their analysts get upset, tell them not to do it. I have heard administrators of government programs that try to convene businesses around adaptation say they put them up on stage and say, please talk about the opportunities that you're pursuing, and they get up there and they just talk about their risk reduction efforts, and then they come off stage and say, we didn't want to sound like we were profiteering. So these things happen. And I think it gets to this point that you sort of mentioned earlier, Marissa, that there's this fear of talking about adaptation. How do we break through that? How do we get over this adaptation is against mitigation is something bad?
So I'm going to be really instructive here and say we had 3 questions there which were all really interesting. What are the policy levers? What's going to speed it up? And how do we get this actually have businesses have the confidence to talk about it. I want you each to choose one bit of that to talk about. I don't mind which bit, and we'll have a kind of closing remark about. And Marissa, maybe if we start from that end and work this way, if that's all right.
Well, maybe if I can take Eric's question, because I really think we've got to express that this is good for business. Right. So you said risk as if that was a bad thing. If I'm an investor in a bank, what do I want to know? My loan book's safe. That's part of it. So I think we have to express this in terms both for the investor community as well as the corporate community that this is fundamentally good business. What did we hear at the very beginning from McCormick? By doing what I'm doing, it's making my supply chain resilient. It is getting, when the next big storm hits, we heard this case study, we were full on. We were able to supply. The money was flowing. That's just good business. So I think we've got to get it. I'm going to go a little bit provocative and say what I don't like about adaptation. It was, and by the way, loss and damage is necessary. I really believe we do have to compensate, so don't misunderstand my message, but let's not make it a victim thing. Let us make it as a good business thing as adaptation. I think that's where it's getting commingled. Then it feels like it's charity, it's a degradation of profits. I'm an investor in a public company, don't go spend money on that. That should be done by the charitable sector. That's where I think it's getting a little bit convoluted.
Roman, do you want to go next before Sanjay? It looks like you did.
I want to start off with a policy question. So I think what can be done, what we've learned in the public space with sovereigns and sub-sovereigns is there's a lot of planning documents there, and investment assumptions are not factored in. It's a technical document, it's a planning document, there's no investment assumptions in there. And how can it be done better? So a really good example that I like, it's already a couple of years old, is an initiative of 44 Polish secondary cities. 44, all of them work with their Met service, get on top of the data, understand what climate brings, and they've put an investment program together. And then with a bit of technical assistance that in comparison cost nothing, we basically were able to put framework loans in place and support those cities in investing in, not everything, but really a meaningful share of the investments that they have singled out as adaptation and mitigation, by the way. The same exercise created, as it is often the case, also really good investment opportunities for reducing emissions. So that is, I guess, a good example. What we learned is that the private sector was not really strongly represented in those conversations. So again, the assumption on the financing should be done together with the businesses in those regions, in those cities, and start from the beginning to include them in the conversation and encourage them to also represent their interest, because it's not that the private sector has to invest by themselves. Of course, there's genuine interest, but there's also a legitimate expectation to be, supported by adaptation measures from, the jurisdiction where they are operating, right? So that should be done better in the future, and it can leverage, have a mutual leverage for those investments. What I want to close with is that I think to encourage people, I'm really curious to see what effect the new regulation in the EU will have on disclosure and on reporting around physical climate risk, what the regulation in the financial industry will bring, because it creates not only a common language, but also a level playing field. So everybody has to come out and showcase how they are being good managers in integrating physical climate risk management and action in their risk frameworks.
Totally, and that level of disclosure, I think, is going to drive greater urgency. I think literally 10 seconds, if I can, from each, because sadly, if we can stay around and carry on talking, we could do that, but I think we need to bring the live stream to an end for those online very, very quickly. So Sanjay and then Michael.
Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. I think people immediately see adaptation as a cost center, something you have to do to avoid worse cost and worse damage later on. But the examples I tried to share are adaptation is a value driver. You can serve your customers better. The examples I gave were these are just better, smarter ways of running business and helping industries to see that adaptation can be an opportunity and help institutional investors to see adaptation as a real investment opportunity. And yet, I'll argue against myself by saying the policy I'd like to see is more mandatory climate risk disclosure and reporting, because I think it's a learning journey. I think industry is going to have to start. Policy I'd like to see is more mandatory climate risk disclosure and reporting, because I think it's a learning journey. I think industry is going to have to start with really understanding the risks and confronting them before they can fully grasp the opportunity to serve their customers better.
Thank you.
Start with really understanding the risks and confronting them before they can fully grasp the opportunity to serve their customers better.
Thank you, Sanjay. And Michael, any closing
I will be
words?
Very brief.
Start with really understanding the risks and confronting them before they can fully grasp the opportunity to serve their customers better.
Thank you, Sanjay. And Michael, any closing
I will be
words?
Very brief here. Marisha nailed it. And when Eric, in answering your question, she nailed it. The only thing I will add is two things. Yes, we tell those analysts that this concept of doing well by doing good is embedded in our strategy. That's one. Two,
Sanjay. And Michael, any closing
I will be
words?
Very brief here. Marisha nailed it. And when Eric, in answering your question, she nailed it. The only thing I will add is two things. Yes, we tell those analysts that this concept of doing well by doing good is embedded in our strategy. That's one. Two, we're proud to show you the progress we're making in those communities where we operate, where we've enabled adaptation and behavioral change and biodiversity implementation. So she nailed it, but that's specific cases. We can have that. And I'm going to be in Davos in January, so we can catch up there.
And I'm going to hand to Bob to close and thank the panel.
We're proud to show you the progress we're making in those communities where we operate, where we've enabled adaptation and behavioral change and biodiversity implementation. So she nailed it, but that's specific cases. We can have that. And I'm going to be in Davos in January, so we can catch up there.
And I'm going to hand to Bob to close and thank the panel.
So first, thanks to this fantastic panel. A round of applause for these guys. And thanks for Emma for moderating this. PwC last year at Davos announced a report that basically
have that. And I'm going to be in Davos in January, so we can catch up there.
And I'm going to hand to Bob to close and thank the panel.
So first, thanks to this fantastic panel. A round of applause for these guys. And thanks for Emma for moderating this. PwC last year at Davos announced a report that basically said 40% of the CEOs believe they would not be in business in 10 years unless they radically changed. Number one was economics. Number two was actually regulation. Number three was... So first, thanks to this fantastic panel. A round of applause for these guys. And thanks for Emma for moderating this. PwC last year at Davos announced a report that basically said 40% of the CEOs believe they would not be in business in 10 years unless they radically changed. Number one was economics. Number two was actually regulation. Number three was digitization. Number four was consumer behavior. Number five was climate. The reality is the first four are all tied back to the fifth. John Kerry the other day said this, and it's worthy of the reminder. We're all working towards mitigation to avoid the worst of the effects, not all of the effects of climate. And if we have that kind of mindset, there are effects that are real, and therefore you have to think about the risks during that process, even if we make it, and then how management reacts to it. So to bring a very quick story to emulate this, and you all focused on ag business, I'm going to go to another place, India, port cities. Two port cities in the same geographic region. 15 years ago, they got 5 days of rain a year. Today, they get 65 days of rain a year, and they get about 5 different flood events. Two different port cities, not that far apart from one another, both of them having about 40,000 people living in those port cities. One of them, failure of leadership from a management perspective, and for that matter, failure of government from a policy perspective in terms of what's needed. And that's the opportunity that's hitting here, because what I gave you was a downside risk scenario and an upside risk potential. And that's the opportunity that we have to create the awareness, get the framing right, and get the upside potential into the whole dialogue. We should not stop this conversation. Let's continue it after we wrap up. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here today. Look forward to the conversations thereafter. Take care. Thanks. Thank you, sir.